The wind came howling from the north, carrying slashes of snow like blades of ice slicing across the sky. The entire Silver Pine National Park seemed to hold its breath beneath a somber white shroud that covered every trail, every peak, and every stream that had frozen weeks ago. No birdsong, no footprints, only the stark silhouettes of bare trees stretched across the snow like silent scars etched into the wilderness. Winter in Silver Pine was not kind. It didn't simply test nature's resilience, it scoured the courage of those who dared survive it. And on that morning, a team was stepping straight into fate's cold hands. They were the Winter K-9 training unit, 5 German shepherds, each a veteran of military, police, or rescue service, none under 6 years old, none without a history of walking the line between life and death. Every step they took was sharp and deliberate, powerful, rhythmic, precise. Even the wind seemed to yield as they passed. Leading the pack was a larger dog, his thick coat a blend of ash and burnt gold, eyes gleaming amber like twin lanterns cutting through the frost-bitten haze. A faded scar ran down the left side of his neck, a mark that time couldn't erase. He never barked without purpose, never wasted a single step, and when he stopped, the entire team followed. His name was Storm. Storm had once served as a military K-9 in the Middle East. During a raid on an insurgent compound, he had thrown himself over a wounded soldier, shielding him from enemy fire. The scar from that day became a silent emblem of loyalty too deep for words. Since his retirement, Storm had grown distant from noisy places. He rejected strangers, refused commands from anyone except his former handler. But in the frozen forest, in the hush of snow-covered trails, Storm moved like he had finally returned to the place he belonged. The K-9 team pushed deeper into the eastern ridge of Silver Pine, where GPS signals faltered and compasses spun uselessly under heavy magnetic interference. Wind shrieked between jagged rocks. Snow buried every pine branch. The trail vanished behind them, replaced only by fresh paw prints and a slow, creeping sense of unease in every vigilant eye. None of them knew that just a few hundred meters ahead, destiny was holding its breath, waiting for Storm to shatter the silence of the woods. At first, no one noticed. It was just a subtle turn of Storm's head to the right, toward a thicket of dark, thorny brush at the forest's edge. Then he stopped completely. 4 paws rooted in the snow, chest tense and swelling like he was preparing to charge a battlefield. Lieutenant Pearson, the lead trainer, opened his mouth to issue a redirection command. But before a single word left his lips, the other dogs moved, without call, without whistle. As one, they broke formation and turned toward where Storm was facing, a silent battalion choosing their own path. "Hold your position!" Pearson barked, but only their tracks remained, trailing into untouched snow. The thin mist stirred beneath the weight of their steps, as if something older than language had summoned them from deep within the trees. "Lieutenant, GPS just flagged it," a young officer called from the tracking monitor. "They've moved 300 meters beyond the safe perimeter." Pearson's brow furrowed. Canine units sometimes sensed anomalies during exercises, but never had an entire team broken rank without command. His eyes locked on Storm, still at the front, ears high, gaze locked on something unseen, something only he could hear. Then Storm began to run. Not a playful run, not one driven by scent or curiosity. It was the run of an animal that had smelled death before and knew it was close. Pearson signaled 2 armed officers to follow with radios. "Stay with them. Don't let them cross into the white zone. Could be a predator, or—" He didn't finish the sentence, because deep down he already knew. Storm never moved without a reason. Beneath the leafless trees, the snow began to change color, faint stains spreading quietly, as if something had been there, something that had survived, or come heartbreakingly close to dying. And Storm was leading them right back to face it. Storm was the first to break through the brittle branches. One by one, the other shadows followed, silent, alert, but utterly unhesitating. The K9 unit came to a halt where the dense forest suddenly gave way to a clearing, frigid and still. The snow there was no longer untouched. It was disturbed, drag marks, erratic imprints, the scarring of a struggle. A body? Slumped against the base of an old pine tree was a young man, chained by thick steel links across his chest and wrists. His arms had been wrenched behind his back, the flesh swollen and torn. His face was pale, lips split and trembling, cheeks streaked with frozen blood caked into the snow like ash. Every breath he took seemed like a fight not to let go. Lucas Renard, Forest Ranger of Zone 7, missing for 3 days, without a trace. One of the chains bit deep into his wrist, so tight it had choked off the blood. The wound had blackened, crusted over. A few hours more, and death wouldn't have been a possibility. It would have been a certainty. His eyes were shut, but his chest still rose and fell in shallow rhythm, like a branch trembling before it snaps. Storm moved closer. No barking, no growl, no wagging tail, just a quiet approach, stopping just short of the man's reach. Ears pricked, eyes locked on Lucas's bruised and battered face. Storm didn't blink, as if he was standing guard not only over the man's fragile life, but over something deeper, something sacred. An officer stepped up, hand reaching toward the injured man. Storm gave a low growl, not aggressive, not hostile, just a warning. Soft, instinctive, absolute. Pearson arrived just in time, catching the officer's wrist. "Let him work," he said quietly. In that moment, in the hush of falling snow, a shaft of sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a fragile glow across Lucas's face. It caught in Storm's amber eyes, creating an image that felt almost sacred, like the forest itself had fallen silent to witness 2 souls at the edge, one nearly lost, and one who refused to let go. Storm lowered his head. Gently, he placed his muzzle against Lucas's arm. He didn't move, didn't press. He simply passed something between them. Warmth, strength, presence, something real enough that Lucas stirred. A flicker. Just one. A finger curled. Pearson froze. "He's alive! Get medevac! Now!" As the rescue team scrambled into motion, voices echoing through the trees, Storm didn't move. He remained there, steady and still, eyes never leaving Lucas, like a silent sentinel posted at the edge of life and death. The emergency radio crackled frantically against the silence of the snow. Lieutenant Pearson pressed the call button, his voice urgent but composed, the kind of composure only earned by those who've stood at the edge of life and death. "We have a critically injured male. Deep coma state. Stage 3 hypothermia. Location, Southeast Silverpine. Coordinates 47.38. Identity confirmed. Forest Ranger Lucas Renard." There was a beat of silence from the dispatch center, just long enough to feel like the world held its breath. Then the reply came fast, clipped. "Nearest med point is the Central Ranger Station. Dispatching snowmobile unit and med team now. Keep the patient conscious if possible. Repeat, keep the patient conscious." But how do you keep someone conscious when their body has nearly frozen solid? Lucas was carefully laid on a makeshift rescue board. His snow-soaked layers were cut away, revealing swollen skin and bruised limbs. Pearson knelt down, ear to chest. The heart was still beating, but faintly. The breath was shallow, barely traceable, sometimes pausing so long it seemed to stop entirely. His face was pale, his brow faintly furrowed, as if every breath was a war between holding on and letting go. Storm still hadn't moved away. He walked beside the rescue board, eyes fixed on Lucas with unwavering intensity. Each time a tremor passed through the ranger's body, Storm edged closer, gently pressing his warm muzzle against the man's hand. A wordless connection. Silent. Steady. Irreplaceable. When the snowmobile team arrived, the sky had already begun to shed a fresh layer of snow. 2 paramedics, bundled in thermal gear, stepped down carrying oxygen kits, heat blankets, and warmed IV bags. A third figure followed, a veterinarian doctor, Claire Harlow. Not because the patient was an animal, but because once, after a battlefield deployment, she had cared for Storm. And she knew one thing for certain. Storm never gave up, not if there was still something left to save. "Heart's weak," Claire murmured, watching the vitals. "But he has a chance. We need to get him to the station now." The snowmobile surged forward through the blinding white, carving a sharp path across the frozen earth. Inside the transport bay, Lucas was connected to warmed IV drips, thermal pads pressed tightly to his chest. Storm remained beside him, unmoving, like a stone lion guarding a temple gate. Every time someone moved too quickly or raised their voice, Storm turned his head with a stare that warned, "Careful. This life is not yours to risk." Claire sat across from him, resting a hand gently on his head. "Good boy, Storm," she whispered, not expecting a reaction, just needing to remind herself that even in chaos, something steady still remained. When they reached the Central Ranger Station, a second emergency team was already waiting. The door swung open, wind howling into the cabin. Lucas, wrapped in thermal blankets, IV still running, was swiftly carried out. But to Storm, the scene unfolded in a different rhythm. Nothing moved too fast. Nothing mattered but the man. Even as the stretcher rolled toward the medical wing, Storm was the first to cross the steel threshold. No orders, no permission needed. Inside the infirmary, an industrial heater roared to life. The air began to warm, but it wasn't enough, not for the cold that had already seeped into Lucas's bloodstream. The monitor emitted a slow, sparse beep. Beep. Barely a heartbeat. Claire and 2 other medics worked quickly, warming blood, setting up oxygen flow, applying chest compressions to aid circulation. Storm sat beside the bed, eyes locked on Lucas's colorless face, the man he had pulled back from death's reach. And then, a flicker. Lucas shifted ever so slightly. His eyelids trembled. Claire froze. "He's responding." A young doctor looked up from the vitals. "Blood pressure rising, heart's stabilizing." The beep, beep, turned faster. Not frantic. Alive. Storm slowly stood, placing one paw on the edge of the bed. His eyes met Lucas's, slowly, steadily. No words were exchanged. But in that moment, in the hush of machines and whispered breath, something passed between them. A promise. A beginning. The harsh white glow from the fluorescent light above made Lucas flinch instinctively. A dull ache pulsed in his wrist, climbing into his shoulder and trailing down his spine, a painful reminder that he was still alive, though he wasn't quite sure why. His eyes opened slowly, vision blurred. The ceiling was unfamiliar. The scent of antiseptic clung to the air. A monitor nearby beeped steadily into the cold silence of the room. He turned his head, slowly, and saw a frost-covered window. Outside, the world was still blanketed in snow. "You're awake." The voice, soft as breath, came from his left. "Claire." He recognized her after a beat. She sat beside the bed, medical chart in hand, a faint, relieved smile playing on her lips. "Storm?" Lucas rasped, as if that name was the only thing still intact from a shattered memory. Claire didn't answer right away. She tilted her head, and as if responding to some unspoken signal, a large gray figure stepped quietly into the room. Storm. He stopped a few steps from the bed, then walked forward, sat down, and locked his gaze onto Lucas's face. Not curious, not instinctive. Watchful. Guarding. Lucas tried to smile. "Still not leaving me, huh?" Storm didn't bark, but his tail gave a gentle wag, just enough to warm the air in the room. Claire placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "If it weren't for him, I'd probably be reading your obituary right now." Lucas closed his eyes for a moment. Behind the darkness of his eyelids, fragments of memory sparked, like torn strips of film, still clinging to light. A map, a drone destroyed, the clatter of chains, a low voice, clipped and threatening. "You've seen too much, Ranger." His eyes flew open. "I was attacked, at least 2 men, faces covered. They didn't steal anything. They just asked me one question." Claire nodded, her face darkening. "We know. Police are combing the site, found strange markings. But you're the only one who knows what really happened." Lucas looked at Storm. The dog's eyes were sharp, like he too was trying to recall something from that snowbound trail. "I was investigating," Lucas said slowly. "For months now I've noticed irregularities. Forest maps being updated with wrong acreage, signs of machinery deep inside the restricted zones. And then..." He hesitated. "One of my trap cams. It caught moving lights, at night. Not animals." Claire's brows furrowed. "Did you report it?" Lucas shook his head. "I was still verifying, but I believe it's connected to illegal logging, drones, fuel residue, vehicles at night. Someone's using this forest for something we've never authorized." He clenched his hand, blood from old bandages seeping faintly through. "And I think they left me there as a message, a warning, that if I kept going, I wouldn't see daylight again." The infirmary fell into silence. Storm still sat unmoving, a sentinel carved from stone. "But you're alive," Claire said, "and you're not alone anymore." Lucas reached out, his hand trembling, and placed it on Storm's head. The dog didn't resist. Instead, he lowered his head just slightly, for the first time. A gesture of acceptance. A beginning. "Yes," Lucas whispered. "I'm not alone, and we're not stopping here." 3 days later, Lucas could sit up without bracing himself. The wounds on his wrists hadn't fully healed, but the blood was flowing again. The doctors said his body was recovering faster than expected, not just because of physical strength, but because of willpower. But Lucas knew something else was driving him. Storm. From the moment he regained consciousness, the dog hadn't left his side for more than a few feet. Storm slept at the foot of the hospital bed at night, and during the day, he sat by the window like a sentinel, as if Lucas's survival had become the final mission etched into his warrior's instinct. No one at the ranger station complained. On the contrary, they left doors open for Storm to move freely from room to room. Though a dog, he carried himself like a seasoned officer, quiet, composed, and always alert. Only Lucas was allowed to touch his neck, where the long scar ran like a faded river of memory. One morning, before the sun rose, Lucas was stirred by the wind hissing through the window crack. Storm lay in the corner, eyes open, as though sleep was never truly necessary. Lucas spoke, his voice rough but calm. "You don't trust anyone, do you?" Storm didn't move. "Just like me." Lucas shifted, pushing himself upright. Storm stood and padded slowly over to the bed. "I used to think I knew this forest better than anyone. The paths of the deer, the scent before a storm, even the sound a tree makes when it falls in silence. but it turns out I didn't know anything at all." Storm sat down, his eyes catching the pale light of the first dawn since the blizzard. Lucas reached out, for the first time, without trembling. Storm lifted his head, and instead of flinching like he usually did with strangers, he leaned forward and rested it in Lucas's open palm. A minute passed. No nurses, no beeping machines, only the shared breath of two beings who had looked death in the face. Claire stepped in just then. She stood still for a moment, watching them, then gave a quiet nod. "I've never seen Storm like this with anyone," she said later. "Not even me, and I treated him after he left the military. He rejected every civilian training program. No one could reach him. No one—" "Until me?" Lucas asked, the disbelief still in his voice. Claire nodded. "You didn't choose him, Lucas. He chose you." Lucas fell silent. He knew too well what it felt like to be broken, to be betrayed by the very place you gave everything to protect. Storm knew that feeling too. Two souls, two scars, one across a wrist, the other down a neck. They weren't just wounds. They were fragments of the past that never fully healed. From that day on, Storm was no longer just a dog in the ranger station. He became something more, a silent companion walking alongside Lucas through every step of his recovery. When Lucas began training in the yard again, Storm trotted beside him. When Lucas studied forest maps, Storm sat nearby, as if reading too. When Lucas pored over old notes on illegal deforestation, Storm lay close, eyes open, listening. Once, Lucas tried standing up without calling him. Within seconds, Storm appeared at his side, like he'd read the thought before it formed. Lucas looked down and smiled softly. "I get it now," he whispered. "You don't belong to anyone. But if I ever lose my way, you'll lead me home." Storm looked up. He didn't bark, just held his gaze, deep, steady, unblinking, as if to say, "And if I fall, you won't leave me behind." 1 week after waking up, Lucas stood in silence before the old topographic map mounted on the wooden wall of the ranger station. His eyes traced the faded green lines printed in waterproof ink, where each patrol route bore a unique symbol: forgotten outposts, snow-covered camera traps, and winding paths still echoing the footsteps of him and his former team. But there was one area, the northeastern edge near the Misty Ridge, that pulled at his thoughts more than any other. He was the one who'd recommended closing off that region after a landslide had uprooted dozens of large trees in the aftermath of a storm. Yet ever since he returned, the more he studied the map, the more something felt wrong. Something had changed, and not in a way nature would allow. He stepped back, narrowed his eyes, and called softly, "Storm, come here." The dog padded over silently and sat at his side, head tilted slightly, as if also studying the lines and symbols with suspicion. Lucas bent down, opened the filing drawer, and pulled out the original map, archived from the year before. The difference was immediate. A small section near the base of the ridge had been altered. A trail now marked Biological Restoration Access had been added. The line was faint, jagged, and broke standard formatting. The ink color didn't match. Lucas said nothing. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a red marker, and circled the altered section. Then he slashed through the trail label with a firm stroke. They're hiding something here. Memories from before the attack began to trickle back, not in a flood, but drop by drop, like water tracing over cold stone. He remembered a night when the scent of gasoline had drifted faintly through the air, not strong enough to set off alarms, but too foreign for a place without vehicle access. Then, for 3 consecutive nights, his wildlife trap cams had gone dark. No signal, no footage. The moon was dim, the forest unnaturally quiet. At the time, he thought it was a technical glitch. Now those fragments were beginning to form links, and one by one, they were falling into place. Lucas opened the bottom drawer. A worn, leather-bound notebook emerged, the edges curled, the pages yellowed by moisture. He flipped to the first page. A line of handwritten text, thin but precise, stared back at him. Strange mechanical sounds. Approximately 2:17 a.m. Direction: north-northeast. Possible drone or recon device. He turned to the next. Unidentified boot prints, large military-grade tread. Not from ranger staff, steady gait, equal stride. Possibly 2 individuals, highly trained. His finger hovered over the final phrase. He underlined the words highly trained. His pulse slowed. Not locals, not amateur loggers. Whoever had attacked him might have been mercenaries or former soldiers contracted to do someone else's dirty work in Silverpine. He looked at Storm. "You saw it too, didn't you? They're not amateurs." Storm didn't react, just held his gaze with that steady, silent calm that needed no words to agree. That afternoon, for the first time since being rescued, Lucas left the ranger station. A lightweight pack hung from his shoulders, carrying only what mattered, the investigation notebook and a small action camera. Storm walked beside him. No leash, no commands. 2 sets of footprints, man and dog, pressed into the fresh snow that had fallen overnight, carving a path into a part of the forest his own colleagues had once warned. Never go back. When they reached the red-circled zone on the map, Lucas stopped. Before them stood a dense barrier of pine trees, almost too evenly spaced, as if arranged to obstruct. The snow here was deeper, the air colder, the woods completely still. Then, in the pale white spread, a narrow rut appeared. Not long, not deep, but just enough to say something heavy had been dragged through here. Recently. Storm lowered his body, nose sweeping close to the ground. He circled once, then again, then gave a sharp, clipped growl. Short, tight. A signal! Lucas raised the camera and began taking photos of the drag marks, of a small shard of metal glinting beneath a crust of ice, and of a torn gray fabric caught on a low branch. Then Storm froze. Lucas looked up in the direction the dog was staring. Through the mist, barely visible between the skeletal trees, loomed a small hut. No lights, no sound, just a shape in the grayness, out of place, like it didn't belong to this forest at all. Lucas stepped back, fingers tightening around the strap of his pack. "We found it." Storm barked once, short, crisp, not from excitement. A confirmation, or a warning. The game had begun. Lucas sat alone in the old map archive room of the ranger station, the soft yellow glow of a desk lamp casting shadows across the worn wooden table. Spread before him were topographic maps from the past 3 years, layer upon layer of the forest's memory. Every mark, every symbol, a scar carved into the living skin of Silverpine. He was comparing the maps year by year, and what he found sent a chill down his spine, colder than the blizzards outside. The northeastern forest, where he and Storm had found those strange drag marks, was slowly vanishing from the official records. In the first map, the area was marked as Biological Restoration Zone, an administrative term used to describe temporary closures for post-wildfire or landslide recovery. But the next year, it had been renamed Inactive Buffer Zone, a vague, bureaucratic non-category. And by the current year, it had disappeared completely. No patrol designation, no ranger assignment, as if it had never existed. Lucas frowned, fingers tracing the top corner of the map where the approval signatures usually sat. The previous years had been signed by either the head ranger or the deputy sheriff. But this year, the signature was blurred, clearly scanned, edited, manipulated. He stood, pulled out an internal use map from the station's drawer, the kind not publicly distributed. There, in the northeastern quadrant, still stood a hexagonal icon. Observation Post, number. Mundram. A name rose instantly in his mind. Evan Colburn. Evan had been Lucas's academy classmate back in Wyoming, a principled man. Quiet, capable, and deeply devoted to nature. After graduation, Evan had been stationed at Post 3, tasked with monitoring biodiversity and documenting rare wildlife sightings. Lucas hadn't heard from him in nearly a year. At first, he assumed Evan had taken extended leave or had been transferred. But now that the observation post had been erased from the maps and the surrounding area had become the epicenter of strange activity, that silence felt like an alarm bell. He returned to the desk, logged into the administrative system, and typed the postcode, SP-OBS3. The system lagged. Data fragments loaded slowly. But then, a single line appeared. Station SPOBS3. Status inactive. Reason: lack of operational budget, voluntary personnel resignation. Date of approval: August 22nd. Authorized by Heron, Deputy Sheriff Heron. Lucas clenched the keyboard. Evan was never the type to voluntarily resign. He'd once said, "If I ever leave this forest, it means I'm dead." So if the resignation wasn't signed by Evan, who did? Lucas printed the full report and headed straight to the physical records room, where all original signed documents were kept. He rifled through the August files until he found it. Evan's supposed resignation notice. But the signature at the bottom, it wasn't his. The strokes were wrong. The B in Colburn didn't have the long tail Evan always added, a small quirk he'd never outgrown from their academy days. Forged. Someone had signed in Evan's name. Someone wanted to erase him quietly, without questions. And if they'd done that, then maybe Evan had discovered something before Lucas ever did. And maybe he had been silenced for it. From his spot beside the desk, Storm lifted his head as Lucas rose sharply to his feet. "We have to go," Lucas said. "Tomorrow." Storm didn't move, but his eyes sharpened, just like they had when he caught the scent of blood beneath the snow. Lucas turned back to the map, circled observation post 3 in red, then drew a line connecting it to the hidden campsite they'd discovered days earlier. Together, the 2 points formed a diagonal path, cutting straight through the so-called buffer zone, an invisible corridor buried beneath layers of paperwork and maps twisted by greed. And someone was behind it. Lucas whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "Evan, if you're still alive, I'll find you. And if you're not, I'll make sure they tremble when they speak your name." The night wind slipped through the cracked window of the ranger station. Moonlight, dimmed by drifting clouds, cast a pale reflection across the worn wooden floor where Storm lay curled, head resting on his front paws, eyes open and watchful. Lucas couldn't sleep. He sat at the small desk tucked in the corner of the room, holding an old photograph, taken at the Forest Ranger Academy. He and Evan Colburn stood side by side, the Wyoming state flag behind them. Evan's gaze in the photo was steady, his smile tight but genuine, the kind of man who chose forest over office, silence over spotlight. Lucas set the photo down and pulled out the map he'd marked in red the night before. His finger traced the winding forest paths, stopping at the spot labeled Observation Post 3. He knew, if something was being hidden, it was there. That post had once been the only active ecological checkpoint in the region, equipped with thermal sensors, underground moisture monitors, and remote wildlife cameras. Evan had run it solo for 3 years. For someone to shut that down, it meant someone needed this part of the forest to go dark. Lucas had no choice left. He stood, crossed the room, and pulled a weathered tactical pack from the cabinet. Inside were essentials: a folding knife, first aid kit, flashlight, a compact recon drone, field notebook, and the old sidearm issued to him during his time in cross-border rescue ops. Storm rose as soon as he heard the zipper slide. He didn't bark. He didn't need a command. He simply moved to Lucas's side. Ready. "Coming with me?" Lucas asked, a familiar ritual. Storm blinked once, then lowered his head. A wordless affirmation. At dawn, Lucas filed a brief report to the station chief. "Field terrain survey near closed sector." He didn't mention suspicion, not because he didn't trust anyone, but because he knew. The fewer who knew, the higher the chance he and Storm would make it back alive if things went south. Just before he left, Claire, the vet, caught him at the station gate. "Where are you going?" she asked, squinting against the morning light, suspicion etched across her face. Lucas hesitated, then said, "Somewhere I should have gone a long time ago." Claire looked at Storm. The scar beneath his gray fur still showed faintly. She didn't press. Instead, she reached into her pocket and handed over a small box, emergency meds, vitamins, and a vial of clotting agent for Storm. "In case something goes wrong." Lucas accepted it with a nod. "Thanks." They departed at 6:12 a.m. The fog was thick. Wind whispered through the treetops like echoes from the past. The path into the closed zone bore no warning signs now, just a trail of crushed grass stretched out like an unhealed wound. Storm led the way, each step measured, cautious, never wasted. Lucas followed, eyes scanning left and right, senses strung tight as wire. He didn't know if someone was watching. But he knew one thing. This wasn't untouched forest anymore. It was a forest full of secrets. After nearly an hour of navigating tangled vegetation, they reached the dry creek bed, once the site of a wildlife camera. Lucas remembered every tree here, but today something was different. Branches recently cut. Deep tire marks sunken into damp earth. Fresh. Storm froze. His hackles rose, ears forward, nose low. Lucas stopped in his tracks. Storm's eyes were locked onto a thicket in the distance, motionless, too motionless. A faint breeze stirred. The air carried a whisper of gasoline. Lucas drew his gun. "Someone's here!" Storm gave a low growl from deep within his throat. Not loud, but sharp. Razor-edged. He'd smelled something Lucas hadn't. And just like that, this was no longer a terrain survey. This was a return to the front line. The deeper Lucas and Storm ventured, the thicker the forest became, as if the land itself were trying to conceal something buried beneath its roots. Sunlight barely pierced the canopy now, reduced to pale, flickering fragments. The air grew dense, almost heavy. Even the wind had vanished. The trees stood like frozen sentinels, watching silently as man and dog moved through their realm. Storm came to a sudden stop, his back arched, ears stiff, nose low to the ground. Lucas held his breath. He followed Storm's gaze. Amid the overgrowth, hidden behind a crude veil of dried leaves and creeping vines, a gray object emerged. Low, steel-sided. No windows, no markings. A hut. Lucas approached slowly like stalking a wild animal. The door hung slightly ajar. Unlocked. His hand reached out, nudging it open. The hinge let out a soft, strained creak. barely audible, yet loud enough to freeze them both. Inside, darkness. The cramped space barely had room for a table, a few storage racks, and several iron cases pushed against the wall. But what lay inside made Lucas stop cold. On the table sat an open laptop, still powered on. Beside it, a military-grade recon drone, its wings folded, the body scratched and worn. A disassembled rifle laid carefully across a cleaning cloth. Beneath the table, several worn military backpacks, streaked with dirt and forest debris, lay abandoned, silent relics of an unnamed mission. Lucas stepped closer. Scattered across the tabletop were printed sheets, satellite imagery of the Silverpine Reserve, marked with red zones and strange symbols. Among the files was a lumber inventory, names of rare timber species, quantities, export dates, and delivery locations. Everything logged in detail, like a warehouse inventory system. He turned over another page. A timber transport permit. At the bottom, the seal of the Forest Management Bureau, and a signature. Evan Colburn. Lucas's heart skipped. Evan had never been authorized to issue permits. And Evan was missing. Storm circled the hut, nose to the floor, each sweep followed by a glance up at Lucas, as if trying to say, "This place isn't empty. Someone lived here, planned here, and someone else erased them from the story." Storm stopped by the far wall, his paw pressed against a raised floorboard. Lucas knelt, unfolded his knife, and pried the board loose. Beneath it was a shallow cavity, and inside a black metal box. Still, heavy, silent. He opened it. Inside were memory cards, several USB drives, and a leather-bound journal. Lucas opened the first page. The handwriting was unmistakable, tilted, steady, familiar. It was Evan's. Each page held precise notes on drones flying at night, on unmarked trucks arriving before dawn, on the sound of chainsaws echoing from forbidden ground, notes on falsified maps, on permits that shouldn't exist, and on a man, powerful, high-ranking within the Ranger Command, who might be behind it all. Lucas shut the journal and slipped it into his pack. Storm hadn't moved. He sat by the door, gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the threshold. He didn't speak, and Lucas didn't ask, because they both understood. This wasn't an abandoned hut. It was a command center, a link in a long-planned chain of crimes, a nerve point in an operation built under the very forest Lucas had once sworn to protect. And here, right here, was the fuse that would ignite everything to come. Lucas was carefully packing the last of the documents when Storm let out a low growl. Not the kind meant for strangers. This one was deeper, sharper, like the scent of danger had just pierced the bark and slipped inside the cabin. Lucas froze, looked up. Storm stood still as stone, his body rigid, tail low, ears fixed on a spot near the base of the wall. His eyes locked on a dark slit between two steel panels, something so small it could have been missed. Lucas crouched, aiming his flashlight at it. A faint red dot flickered behind a patch of dried leaves, barely visible, fading in and out. A sensor, not the kind used for wildlife research. This was a low-range motion alarm, built to detect movement within a 3-meter radius, just enough to register someone entering, lingering, or getting too close to the hub. Lucas's heart missed a beat. They'd been detected. It didn't matter how long they'd been inside. One ping, 10 minutes ago or 10 seconds, was enough to alert whoever ran this place. And if he was right, they were already on their way. He sprang to his feet, threw the pack over his shoulder, eyes darting to Storm. "Let's move." Storm didn't need a second order. He shot out of the hut like a gray shadow. Lucas followed, each footfall thudding through the forest floor like an alarm in his ears. The woods were no longer shelter. They were now the battlefield. They'd covered less than 100 meters when Storm halted. His body stiffened. The wind shifted, and with it came the scent of gasoline and human sweat. Scent that did not belong to the forest. Lucas pressed against a tree trunk, slowing his breath. Then he heard it, faint at first. Twigs breaking under boots, not one person, multiple. And they weren't trying to be quiet. He glanced at Storm. The dog was growling low again, warning in his throat. He turned to Lucas, eyes glowing in the underbrush. They weren't going back the way they came. That path was cut off. Lucas motioned right. They moved in an arc, curving through a sloped ridge, hoping to find a back route across the dry creek and back toward the station. But the forest here was thick. Fallen trees blocked the trail, the ground slick and sunken with mud. Behind them, the footsteps grew louder. Closer. No doubt now. They were being hunted. Lucas drew his sidearm, flicked off the safety. He had no more than 6 rounds, not enough to win, but maybe enough to break through, if luck was on their side. A branch cracked behind him. Lucas froze. Storm spun with a snarl. 2 shadows lunged from the right. One had a weapon raised. Lucas didn't hesitate. His finger tightened. The first shot ripped through the silence. The armed figure dropped. Whether hit or not, he didn't get up. The second came from a different angle. Storm was faster. 40 kilos of trained muscle slammed into the man's chest, knocking him to the ground with a dull, crushing impact. Lucas closed the distance, pinned the second attacker with a knee, and wrested the weapon from his hands. He recognized the face. One of the poachers Evan had documented in his journal. No time to question. Shouts echoed through the woods. At least 2, maybe 3 more closing in. Lucas pulled Storm back. Together they sprinted toward the dry creek. Then, crack. A bullet split the air, tearing through a tree trunk just inches ahead. Splinters exploded like shrapnel. Storm veered instantly, leading Lucas into a narrow crevice between 2 mossy boulders, just wide enough to crawl through. They dove in. Gunfire erupted behind them, voices shouting in fury as their prey slipped from reach. Lucas and Storm tumbled down a slope, landing hard in a shallow snow trench. Lucas gasped, gripping his pistol. Blood seeped from a gash on his arm, scraped on a sharp rock during the fall. Storm lay beside him, panting, alert, his eyes fixed on the ridgeline above. This wasn't safety. This was only a pause, a breath of silence before the next storm. And Lucas knew, from this moment on, the hunt had begun. Dry leaves rustled behind them. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint trace of smoke, metal, and something else, human sweat. Familiar but not Lucas's, not from anyone at the ranger station. Storm growled, low, focused, primal, his back arched, ears locked forward, tail dropped low. His body was no longer that of a dog. It was a weapon, set and ready. Lucas recognized that stance. It was the same look that had once saved dozens of Storm's squad mates in combat. When Storm hunted, he never hesitated. Lucas crouched, drawing the pistol from his side holster. 5 rounds left. Not enough to win, but maybe enough to carve an escape. He pressed his back against a thick tree trunk, eyes scanning for exit options. Then, crack! A loud snap echoed through the forest. A thick branch fell, crushed under someone's boot. Storm bolted, a gray blur streaking through the underbrush before Lucas could speak. 2 figures emerged from the opposite side, bursting from the thickets as if released by a countdown. The first raised his weapon, but Lucas fired first. The shot sliced through the cold air, striking the man in the shoulder. He fell back with a cry. The second dropped low, trying to close the distance. Lucas stepped back, slipped. His knee hit the wet leaves with a jolt of pain. Before the attacker could reach him, a heavy impact cracked through the air. Storm launched from behind a fallen tree, crashing into the man's chest. They tumbled through a patch of thin snow. Storm bit down on the man's arm, growling, jaws clamped tight. The man struggled, fumbling for a blade at his waist, but Storm was faster. Lucas staggered up, gun raised, moving toward them. Then, bang! A shot rang out from deeper in the woods. Not his. Storm flinched. His body wavered to the side. Blood splattered across the snow, staining the white with a sudden bloom of red. The bullet had struck his left shoulder. Deep, but not fatal. Lucas shouted. Storm pulled back, but didn't whimper. He growled even louder, gaze never leaving his target. He swayed but stayed on his feet. The wound wasn't lethal, but it was bleeding badly. The attacker lay on the ground, gasping, clutching his mangled arm. Lucas leveled his pistol at the man, recognized him. One of the poachers Evan had documented. One of the faces from the journal. But Lucas's attention was elsewhere. Storm, still standing, still staring, shaking slightly, but never blinking. The wind rose again, carrying new footfalls, heavier, closer. 2 more at least, maybe more. Lucas gritted his teeth, pistol trembling in his hand from adrenaline, but his eyes stayed on Storm. "Back off," he whispered. "This isn't the place. We're leaving." Storm looked at him, then bowed his head. A silent answer. Lucas grabbed his pack strap, yanked it hard. He broke into a run, Storm following close behind. Every step the dog took left a faint streak of blood across the snow, but he didn't falter. He didn't fall. They sprinted west, toward an old trail once used for research supply runs. No one had touched that path in over 3 years, but Lucas remembered every dip, every twisted root. Behind them, the pursuit drew louder. Gunfire burst from afar, slamming into tree trunks, knocking bark into the air like shrapnel. Lucas veered right, dragging Storm into a narrow chute between 2 moss-covered boulders. They tumbled into a muddy ravine. Lucas hit the ground hard, shoulder-scraping rough roots on the way down. Storm slid beside him, letting out a faint whine. Lucas turned instantly, cradling the dog, hand pressed tight to the bleeding wound. "Just hold on," he whispered, voice cracking. "We're not done yet." Storm panted, head resting in Lucas's arm, his tail wagged. Once, above them footsteps faded. Then silence. They had lost the trail, at least for now. Lucas leaned back against the cold earth wall, chest heaving. He pulled out a torn cloth and pressed it over Storm's wound. His hand trembled, but he didn't stop. In the distance, the forest dimmed. The last light of day filtered through the canopy as dusk settled over the woods. The first clash was over, and it left a warning written in blood. The night wind began to sweep down the mountain slopes, dragging with it a chill that cut through skin and bone. Lucas sat close against the earthen wall, his jacket now draped over Storm's body. The dog lay beside him, breathing heavily, his left shoulder soaked in blood despite the makeshift bandage. Lucas didn't dare close his eyes. His ears strained for every sound from the forest, snow slipping from branches, the distant buzz of insects, and the relentless thud of his heartbeat in his chest. And then, a soft beep came from inside his backpack. Startled, Lucas reached for his side pocket. The GPS tracker he had attached to Storm's collar was flashing, a steady green light. A signal had been sent. And more than that, there was a response. The ranger station had received it. Help was on the way. Lucas exhaled sharply, as if surfacing from underwater. He leaned over Storm. The dog's eyes were closed, but his ears still twitched. Lucas placed a hand on his back. "Hey," he whispered. "The patrol's coming. You did good, Storm. You led them here." Soon after, beams of high-powered flashlights swept across the trees, cutting through the darkness. Boots crunched through the underbrush. Radios crackled. A voice called out, "Lucas! Lucas Renard! If you can hear us, respond!" Lucas summoned what strength he had, stood, raised his flashlight and clicked it 3 times. The rescue signal. Light flickered in reply from the distance. Then a voice. Closer. "We've got him! He's here!" 3 rangers in reflective jackets rushed in. One knelt beside Storm to assess the wound. Another steadied Lucas as he staggered. Behind them came Rachel Vance, the new station commander, flanked by 2 armed patrol members. She was out of breath, but when her eyes fell on Storm, still lying beneath the coat, her expression hardened. "Ambush!" Lucas rasped. His voice was hoarse. "They came back." At least 3. 1 wounded. 2 still out there. Rachel nodded. No hesitation. No questions. She signaled to her team. "Secure the area around the hut. Set a perimeter. Take them alive if possible." 2 rangers broke off in the direction Lucas indicated. Weapons ready, lights cutting through the forest. Meanwhile, another ranger began administering first aid to Storm. The bleeding was controlled. The pulse, still strong. A glancing shot, soft tissue only. No bones shattered, no major vessels hit. Lucas dropped to the ground, his back against the cold earth. Sweat clung to his spine. He looked over and saw Storm crack one eye open. The dog nudged his muzzle against Lucas's hand. A soft gesture. No words needed. He understands, Lucas thought. "He knows we made it," a voice shouted from deep in the woods. Then another. Footsteps. Moments later, 2 rangers emerged, escorting a man in restraints, mud-caked, jacket torn, limping, one of the attackers. Now reduced to fear as he met the rescue team's gaze. Another was captured near the dry creek, caught trying to tamper with the emergency radio beacon. Too late. They hadn't escaped. Rachel stood and turned to Lucas. "We've got it under control now," she said, voice steady. "You just helped us crack open a major piece of this operation." Lucas looked toward Storm. "Not me," he said softly. "Him." Rachel nodded. She walked to Storm, gently stroked along his back. "You're a hero, Storm," she whispered. From afar, the thrum of helicopter blades began to echo, medical evac from the central station. Moments later, light from the chopper cut through the trees, setting the forest aglow. Lucas pushed himself to his feet, swaying but steady. His eyes stayed fixed on the light above. They had survived. And now, that same light would lead them forward, to uncover the truth that had long been buried beneath the shadows. 48 hours after the confrontation in the woods, the air inside the Silverpine Ranger Station felt heavy, like even the wooden walls were holding something back. Outside, snow continued to fall, thicker now, as if trying to bury the blood still seeping beneath the pines. But inside, the silence had given way to action. Lucas sat at the table, his left arm wrapped in fresh white bandages. His eyes didn't move from the computer screen where Rachel was presenting the data extracted from the laptop found at the hidden hut. Each file that opened was like a cut, slashing through the polished surface someone had spent years crafting to legalize the illegal. The first document appeared, just a basic spreadsheet. But the header froze everyone in place. Delivery records, logging site zone 7. Below it, lists of tree species, cutting dates, shipment locations, transport trucks, crate numbers, and inspection codes, all stamped with valid identifiers issued by the Wyoming State Forest Management Bureau. The problem was, Zone 7 had been designated a strict conservation area 3 years ago. "These are forged?" Lucas asked. Rachel shook her head and pulled up a PDF. It was a scan of an official permit, signature, QR code, government seal. Everything checked out. Then she pointed to the fine print. "Issued by recommendation. Heron D., Deputy Sheriff." Lucas stared at the name. His pulse slowed. It all started here, with a name, a seal, a permit created with nothing more than a mouse click. The investigation became official. State police coordinated with financial auditors and the Environmental Crimes Task Force. The inquiry spread beyond Silverpine. Every log record, every delivery point, every company in the supply chain was re-examined, and piece by piece, a picture began to form. Companies that once seemed unrelated, a stone quarrying firm, a wind energy company, an ecological consulting agency, all traced back to a common link, a private investment fund based in Delaware. The name behind that fund? A well-known real estate mogul who had recently acquired over 200 acres of land surrounding the Silverpine Reserve, pending state approval for a zoning change. Lucas held the contract copy in his hands, his grip tightening. "They're building a resort," he said. His voice was calm, but it dropped like a truth no one had dared speak aloud. "They clear the forest, sell the timber, launder the profits through shell companies, and to make sure no one finds out, they pull strings from the inside." Another set of documents painted the picture more clearly: manipulated personnel files, rangers reassigned without explanation, observation stations shut down quietly. Post 3, where Evan once worked, was the first link removed. Evan had found something, and Evan disappeared. Rachel turned the screen toward Lucas. "You need to hear this." She played an audio file. There was static, then a low, familiar voice came through. Slow. Measured. "Don't let him find the observation post. As for the paperwork, say the funding was cut. Everything's already signed." Lucas didn't need to hear the rest. That voice. Heron. Deputy Sheriff Heron, the man who once had his back on joint patrols, the man who toasted his promotion as North Sector lead, the man who used to call him the last guardian of the forest, and the same man who had signed off on Evan's erasure from the system. Rachel stopped the recording, her eyes locked on Lucas. "We can't keep this quiet," she said. "The state's getting involved. This network isn't just one man. It includes people in the resource office, political donors, and some of them—" She paused. "Used to wear the same uniform as us." Lucas said nothing. He just sat there, still and silent, like the forest outside, where the wind still blew and the snow still fell. But beneath it, the roots were splintering. Then he stood. "Then this time," he said, eyes fixed on the window, where Storm lay resting on the porch, stitches across his shoulder, "we're not just going after forged paperwork." He drew a slow breath. "We're bringing the light down to its roots." That morning, the Silverpine Ranger Station was silent, not for lack of people, but because everyone was waiting. News of the failed ambush in the forest, the documents retrieved, and the audio pulled from the laptop at the hidden hut, it had all been reported to the state government office. An internal investigation had begun, and the first name on the list was Heron Douglas, deputy sheriff of the county. But he hadn't stepped down. Lucas stood by the wooden hallway, eyes fixed on the parking lot, where a familiar gray SUV had just pulled in. The door opened slowly. Heron stepped out, still in full ranger uniform, the gold badge on his shoulder dulled by years of snow and rain. His face didn't change. No urgency, no defensiveness, only silence heavy with meaning, followed each step. Storm lay resting on the porch. As Heron approached, the dog lifted his head. No bark, no growl, but his eyes narrowed, sharp as a blade freshly honed. Lucas moved forward, blocking the steps. "Heron!" Heron looked at him. His gaze was steady, but devoid of the warmth that once defined their years working side by side. What remained felt more like endurance. "Heard you walked through hell," Heron said, voice low. Lucas nodded slightly. "And I'm still in it." A faint smile tugged at Heron's mouth, cold and thin. "Hell has layers, Lucas. Not all of them burn. Some are just quiet." Lucas locked eyes with him. "Where's Evan?" Heron paused, half a second, then stepped up one more rung. "I don't know what you're talking about." "There are papers with your name, authorizations with your signature, an audio file. I sign hundreds of documents a week." "And among them," Lucas said, voice tightening, "are permits to cut protected forest, approvals to rezone conservation land, orders to shut down Observation Post 3. They all lead back to one place." Heron said nothing. He stood there, eye to eye with Lucas, neither denying nor flinching. "Everyone has to choose a side, Lucas," Heron finally said. His tone was calm, almost instructional. "You think I did this for money? Number, I did it for reality, because I know preserving everything won't save the forest. But if we sell a piece, plan it right, we get funds, infrastructure. We get a chance to protect what's left." "With destruction and deception?" Lucas asked. "With survival in a world where there are no heroes," Heron replied. "Only survivors. And the forgotten." A long silence followed. Wind whistled down from the mountains, rattling the wooden walls, brushing thin snow off the porch. Lucas's voice dropped. "I trusted you. You were the one who pulled me back up after my first shift nearly killed me. And now you stand here, still trying to make it all sound justified." Heron didn't answer. He looked at Storm, still unmoving. The dog's stare bore through him like it could see marrow. Then he looked back at Lucas. "You think you'll change anything?" Heron asked, voice flat. "You have your evidence, and you think that'll bring down the system? The ones funding this? You think they'll tear down the machine for one missing ranger and a few felled trees? You're naive, Lucas. You still don't understand the game." "I'm not playing your game," Lucas replied softly. "I'm just turning on the light over what you've tried to bury." Behind Heron, the office door opened. A state investigator stepped outside. "Heron Douglas," he said clearly. "You're requested to cooperate with the investigation. Please come with us." Heron looked at Lucas one last time. He didn't argue. He didn't lash out. He said nothing. But as he stepped past Storm, his eyes dropped, just slightly. Not out of fear, but because he knew some things, no matter how deeply buried, will always be sniffed out. Like the scent of betrayal. That night, the wind changed direction. It no longer swept down from the mountains like it usually did, but instead clawed upward from the base of the forest, carrying with it a cold that sank deep into the bones. Snow continued to fall, light as dust, covering the tire tracks in the station yard like nothing had ever happened. Outside, the world was clean and white. But inside, beneath the old wooden beams, the air was thick, like something unfinished still lingered. Heron had been taken away in silence. The video of his arrest hadn't gone public, but within the ranks of law enforcement, his name was already a crack in the ice, a sign that something long frozen was starting to fracture. And yet Lucas felt no relief, because he knew the system Heron was part of wouldn't fall from one voice recording and a handful of documents. And Storm knew it too. Since returning from his injury, the dog no longer slept as deeply as before. He stayed up at night, pacing the station grounds before finally settling by the door. Every step was cautious. Ears up, nose tense, like he was trying to peel back the scent of something buried deeper than the cold. At first, Lucas thought it was trauma. Combat K-9s, especially the ones who served long tours, often came back with heightened alertness, but by the third night after Heron's arrest, Lucas realized this wasn't instinct, it was warning. That night he stayed up later than usual, going over the files recovered from the hut and transcripts from the investigation meetings. The window beside him was cracked slightly, letting in damp, icy air. The desk lamp cast long, trembling shadows across the open notebook, like pine branches swaying in a storm. Storm lay nearby, head resting on Lucas's leg. Silent. Still. Then, without a sound, he shot upright, his front legs locked, ears spiked, back arched. Lucas looked up. "What is it?" Storm's eyes didn't blink, fixed on the window, on the darkness between the trees, where distant trunks trembled faintly in the mist. Then he growled, low, barely audible, but dense and sharp as steel. Lucas rose and turned off the lamp. The room sank into shadow, lit only by the faint silver wash of moonlight through the thin pane of glass. He stepped to the window, pulled the curtain aside, and narrowed his eyes to adjust. At first there was nothing, just fog curling between the trees. But then, something moved. Fast, low to the ground, gliding through the tree line, silent but undeniable. A shape. Something his instincts recognized before his brain did. Lucas clenched his fists. Storm was already at the door, frozen, staring into the dark. No barking, no charging, just waiting. Lucas grabbed his pistol, checked the rounds. No alarms, no floodlights. He didn't want to alert them, if they were watching. He opened the door. The cold slapped his face. Storm stepped out first. No sound, no sudden movement. He just stood on the porch like a statue carved from instinct, eyes locked on the forest, not as a sentinel, but as something that had seen more than humans were built to understand. Lucas followed, standing beside him, and then he heard it. Not footsteps, not voices, but a faint metallic sound, the unmistakable chime of chain links brushing against wood. Lucas's heart thudded. He knew that sound. It had haunted his memory since the hours he spent chained to that pine in the middle of the woods. The sound of steel embedded in bark, clinking when the wind passed through. But here, there was no tree with a chain, no wind strong enough to make metal sing. Someone was reminding him. Storm stepped back once, then looked up, directly at the second-story window of the ranger station. No one stayed there. No light was ever turned on there. Lucas followed his gaze. Nothing. But he knew. This silence wasn't the end. It was the retreat of a wave before the black tide returned. 3 days after the attempted break-in, the snow turned to sleet. Not the gentle flakes that usually fell quietly over Silverpine, but thick, heavy sheets, wet and smothering. The entire ranger station vanished under a blanket of ice. The whole forest looked buried beneath a frozen quilt. Rachel ordered patrols to be limited, consolidating personnel and resources back to the main station. After the explosive findings, securing both people and data became the highest priority. Reports of the illegal logging operation had been submitted to the state. Several arrests had been made, others suspended. But some were growing restless. Lucas knew. The tighter you squeeze, the more dangerous what remains in the shadows becomes. Cornered men don't plan to win. They bite back, just to take everyone down with them. That night, wind howled so hard the windows rattled in their frames. The station turned off its lights early, partly to conserve backup power, mostly out of habit, survival instinct. Lucas stayed awake. Storm didn't have to. He hadn't slept deeply since the ambush. Near midnight, while Lucas was finalizing a report, the power went out. No warning, no surge, just darkness. He stood, checked the breaker. No sparks, no burnt circuits. The backup generator still had fuel, but there was no sound from the engine room. He turned, about to step into the hallway, when Storm shot to his feet. No growl, just motion, ears up, eyes locked on the rear door, the one that led to the supply shed and the vehicle yard. Then, a soft click, like a latch being drawn, or a steel door slipping open. Lucas grabbed his gun and pressed his back to the wall. Storm moved ahead, silent as a shadow. They stayed close, inching down the hallway. Their only light came from the soft red glow of Storm's GPS collar. As they neared the tech bay, Lucas heard it. Clicks, steady, deliberate. Someone was activating something. He signaled Storm to halt. Then, whoosh, a sudden orange flash burst from beneath the door. And with it, smoke. Thick, dark, laced with gasoline. Lucas's chest tightened. This wasn't theft. It wasn't murder. It wasn't escape. They were setting the station on fire. He charged the door, weapon drawn, and kicked it hard. It flew open. Inside, a drum of fuel had been dumped across the floor. A man, tall, hooded, was sparking a rag soaked in gasoline. Lucas didn't have time to fire, but Storm did. The dog launched like a bolt of thunder, slamming into the man a second before the flame touched the floor. The impact knocked the gas drum aside. The fire caught the wall, missing the spill by inches. Lucas rushed in, gun trained. The man groaned on the floor, Storm's teeth locked around his arm. Outside, boom. A small explosion lit the sky. Through the windows, Lucas saw flames dancing over the technical vehicle. They'd soaked it in fuel. That was the decoy. He grabbed his radio. "Rachel, someone's torching the station. They're hitting us from behind." "We're coming in! Hold your position!" Her voice snapped back over the static. Lucas dragged the man out of the bay, tossed him onto the snowy ground, now speckled with burning cinders. Storm stood guard, still growling low. In the distance, flashlight beams swept through the trees. Rachel and the rapid response team had arrived. One ranger dashed to douse the burning truck. The others converged on the station. "You okay?" Rachel asked, breathless. Lucas nodded. "One attacker. There's at least one more. Someone shut the generator and opened the rear access. He's still out there." Rachel raised her weapon. "Sweep the station. Check the basement and ventilation shafts." The fire was under control within 10 minutes. The man Storm took down was captured alive. He said nothing. He just laughed, eyes blank, as if this was all part of some final game. Lucas looked around the station, smoke scarred and scattered. Storm sat at the top step, chest rising and falling, muzzle streaked with soot. But his eyes never left the far end of the yard, where the trees stood buried in snow and shadow. "They're not done," Lucas said almost to himself. Storm didn't move. Only his tail shifted just once, not out of relief, but readiness. Ash still lingered in the air as the response team fanned out, searching for any trace of the one who escaped. The ranger station glowed in flickers of backup light, its walls still heavy with the scent of charred wood and gasoline, a silent warning that the battle wasn't over. Lucas stepped into the hallway, eyes fixed on the northern edge of the forest. From that direction, the wind carried something faint, so subtle it might have been mist. But Storm stopped. Suddenly, completely. His head rose, ears sharpened, eyes scanning, not fixed on a single point but sweeping left to right, listening to something no human could perceive. Lucas held his ground, pistol drawn, chambered and ready. Beside him, Storm let out a low, breathless growl, barely audible. He took a step back, then turned, a deliberate glance. Not the main path. Avoid the direct route. "You lead," Lucas whispered. Storm pivoted. No leash needed, no command spoken. He bolted toward the narrow trail along the side of the station, the old utility route once used to haul timber, now little more than a snow-covered corridor between two rocky outcroppings. Lucas followed. Every paw print Storm left in the snow was precise, deliberate, not a single step wasted. The wind howled again, and this time Lucas heard it too. A faint metallic clink, metal brushing wood, far off but real. He froze, fingers tightening around the grip of his weapon. Storm had stopped at a fallen tree blocking the path. He didn't leap over. Instead, he lowered his snout to the ground, then veered right toward a narrow gap between two snowbanks, just wide enough to slip through unnoticed. Lucas followed. They moved deeper into the woods behind the station. Patrol lights swept through the main grounds in the distance, but no one else had sensed what Storm had. After a few minutes, Storm suddenly flattened himself against the snow, ears pinned, eyes locked forward. Just ahead, a low bush by the old perimeter fence. Lucas knelt beside him, hand resting on the dog's back. "You see something?" Storm didn't move, but Lucas knew. He felt it. Then, motion. A shadow slipped behind the brush. Low, crouched, dressed in dark clothing. One hand held something long, metallic. The other dragged a heavy canvas bag. Lucas raised his weapon, but didn't fire. The figure hugged the fence line, moving slow, checking every angle. He was heading for the basement access, the side door behind the storage unit, rarely used, rarely locked. And behind it, sensitive data, audio files, and every document linked to the organization. If he got inside, everything could be erased. Lucas didn't wait. "Storm, intercept!" The dog launched like a missile. A blur of gray sliced through the night. The intruder turned. Too late. Storm crashed into his chest, slamming him to the ground like a sledgehammer. The man dropped the bag. His weapon clattered to the snow. Lucas stormed in, pistol raised. "Don't move!" The man wheezed, face pressed into the snow, soaked to the bone. Storm pinned his arm, jaws near the wrist, teeth bared but holding back. Rachel and the patrol team arrived less than a minute later. Flashlights flared across the scene, Storm restraining the suspect, Lucas standing firm, snow on his shoulders, smoke still rising in the air. The darkness, finally torn apart by instinct and resolve. After the suspect was cuffed and taken from the scene, Lucas walked back to Storm. The dog looked up at him, no wag, no praise needed, just a nod. And once again, he had been right. Lucas knelt, hand resting gently on the dog's back. "If it weren't for you, they might have won this time." Storm didn't look at him. His gaze remained fixed on the forest beyond, where the night still lingered. And Lucas understood. In that silence, Storm had heard what no one else could. Once more, it was him. The quiet survivor of silent wars, who had stopped the final flame before darkness could consume it all. The scent of ash still hung in the air when the last responders dispersed into the woods, chasing the trail of the one who got away. The ranger station flickered under backup lights, Burned wood and gasoline lingered in the walls, like a warning that this wasn't over. Lucas stood in the hallway, eyes locked on the northern tree line. From that direction the wind had gone still. No more snow, no more noise, just silence so deep he could hear his own heartbeat, and Storm's slow, heavy breathing beside him. Then Storm growled. But it wasn't the low warning from before, it was sharper, urgent, a sound of alarm. And at that same moment, a gunshot cracked through the air, from the tool shed, where the patrol had just cleared, less than 5 minutes ago. Lucas spun. "Storm!" The dog bolted before the command left his lips. Lucas followed, gun drawn. They tore through the snow, past the corridor between the two cabins, rounding toward the side yard. And there he was. Mark Howie, dressed in black, face hidden beneath a hood, shotgun in hand, old, battered, but deadly. He wore a twisted grin, the kind of smile that comes from knowing you've already lost and don't care anymore. "Well, well, Ranger," Mark hissed through clenched teeth. "Thought taking down Heron meant it was over?" Lucas didn't answer. His eyes never left the muzzle of the shotgun. "You don't understand anything," Mark sneered. "We're not just selling lumber. You think this is about profit?" He took a step forward. "You ever hear about the land buried during the war? About the deals the state made with its donors? You think trees are the only thing growing out here?" Lucas moved slowly, recalculating the distance. "I don't care what you're hiding beneath the ground," he said coldly. "I just know the forest's not a place to bury your secrets." Mark chuckled dryly. "Then maybe it's the place we bury you." He squeezed the trigger, but the blast didn't come from him. Storm struck first. A gray bolt of fury burst through the darkness, crashing into Mark's chest, but Mark had anticipated it. In that split second, he jerked the barrel downward and fired. The gunshot split the night. Storm was thrown backward, his body slamming into the snow, sliding, motionless. "Storm!" Lucas screamed. He fired. The bullet ripped through Mark's left shoulder. The man howled, staggering back. But he didn't fall. Snarling like a wounded animal, he yanked a combat knife from his belt and lunged. They collided in the snow, grappling in a blur of fists, blood, and breath. Lucas blocked the first stab with both hands. Pain exploded across his palms. Mark was stronger, wilder, his eyes bloodshot with desperation. Lucas twisted, knocking the blade away, driving his fist into Mark's jaw. Once, twice. Still, Mark clawed upward. Lucas grabbed the nearby pistol, lifted it, and stopped. The barrel hovered just inches from Mark's chest. The man froze, panting, blood spilling from his shoulder. "Do it!" he spat. "But you know, I'm not the only one. Dogs like you, loyal or not, you won't change a damn thing." Lucas said nothing. For one long breath, the gun stayed in the air. Then Lucas lowered the hammer. "Number, but we'll start." In the blink that followed, Lucas slammed the pistol against Mark's temple. The blow dropped him flat into the snow. Lucas didn't wait. He ran straight to Storm. The dog lay still in a red stain across the white. Blood pooled beneath his shoulder, where the shot had hit, near the scapula. Lucas dropped to his knees, hands trembling, cradling Storm's head against his chest. "Storm, listen to me." No movement. Lucas pressed his hand to the dog's chest. Faint, but beating. "You don't get to leave me. Not now." His voice cracked. "Not after everything we've been through." Storm stirred. Barely. But his eyes cracked open, hazy, exhausted, refusing to close. Lucas tore a field dressing from his belt, pressed it hard to the wound, and grabbed his radio. "Rachel, medical team to the side yard now. Storm's been hit." A rushed voice answered back. Lucas didn't move. He stayed there, one hand over the wound, the other wrapped around the dog's body. No one else touched him. Not until help arrived. Because Storm wasn't just a partner. He was a piece of this story. And it was a story that wasn't finished yet. Inside the State K-9 Medical Center, everything felt unnaturally sterile, as if sealed off from the rest of the world. The air was thick with antiseptic. Fluorescent lights buzzed quietly above polished white tiles. In Treatment Room 4, the surgical lamp had just gone dark. The procedure had taken nearly 3 hours. Chief Veterinary Surgeon Dr. Clara Harlow pulled off her mask and exhaled slowly. Sweat clung behind her ears, despite the room's constant 18-degree temperature. She gave her colleague a nod, peeled off her gloves, and stepped into the hallway, where Lucas sat like a statue. The bandage on his arm hadn't been changed. His jacket was still stained with Storm's dried blood. His eyes, after a sleepless night, were red and hollow, so much so that the man who once led search operations through blizzards now looked like someone who'd left a piece of himself outside the operating room. Clara sat beside him. She didn't soften the truth. The bullet missed the lung, but just barely. We had to stitch up the shoulder muscle, control bleeding, and monitor for infection. Lucas didn't ask. He simply nodded, his eyes still locked on the frosted window of the recovery room. "Storm's going to make it," she said next. A whisper, as if delivering news too fragile to hold aloud. Lucas closed his eyes. 1 second, then 2. His chest rose sharply, then fell. "Thank you," he said. And for the first time since the night of the attack, his voice broke. Not the voice of a commander, but of someone who had just been given back a piece of his heart. A few hours later, with the first light of morning slipping through the windows, Storm opened his eyes. No whimper, no jolt, just the slow, steady blink of amber eyes, as if rising from darkness into day. His gaze remained sharp, not dulled, not the eyes of a dog lost in trauma. Clara checked his vitals. Heart rate stable, breathing deep, muscle response intact. Then she signaled silently. Lucas stepped in. His hands trembled. He approached Storm's bed, where the dog lay on his side, left leg braced with white gauze, fur shaved back to reveal the neat line of stitches. Storm looked at him. No bark, no wag. But in that moment, with the heart monitor's rhythm soft behind them and golden light falling through the window, Lucas felt something he couldn't explain. He knelt, placing a hand on Storm's neck, where the old scar still ran beneath the fur. "You did it again," he whispered. "Another win?" Storm didn't move. But he blinked, slow, deliberate, as if nodding. Rachel arrived shortly after. She took one look, then quietly stepped back out. Whatever was happening in that room didn't need witnesses. Everyone had heard Storm survived. But seeing it, seeing him awake, seeing Lucas whisper something only they could understand, made it real. Some battles in the forest weren't fought with bullets and blood. They were fought with something that couldn't be trained, couldn't be named, couldn't be replaced. Lucas stayed with Storm that entire morning. He told him everything. That Mark Howey had been taken into custody, that the data was safe, that the observation posts were being restored, and that they still had work to do. Storm closed his eyes again, not from exhaustion, but as if listening, as if absorbing every word. "Get some rest," Lucas said, placing a hand gently on his brow. "We've got a forest to protect." Storm didn't reply, but his breathing grew steadier. Outside, the snow had begun to melt. The story first began to spread from a simple post on the Wyoming State Forestry Department's internal board. A single sentence, attached to a photo of Storm resting after surgery. "This dog led us into the forest, saved a ranger from death, and stood on the edge of life to guard the woods from betrayal." No one expected what followed. Within 6 hours, the post had gone viral. Thousands of shares, tens of thousands of comments. Then came the press. National television picked up the story. Local stations launched special coverage. Storm, Guardian of Silverpine. That's what they called him. A title no one gave. It simply emerged, born from gratitude. A short video clip captured by a patrol team's helmet cam showed Lucas kneeling in the snow, his hands soaked in blood, cradling Storm beneath sweeping beams of flashlight as he called for help. No music, no narration, just a man holding his dog, in desperation and in hope. A week later, CNN sent a reporter to the K9 Center for an interview. Lucas declined. But Storm couldn't escape the spotlight. Photos were taken of him walking slowly through the white hallways, one front leg still wrapped in bandages, his eyes clear, steady, as if nothing had ever happened. "He doesn't need the spotlight," Lucas told one journalist. "He just needs to know the forest is still breathing." People called it a kind of loyalty that couldn't be bought. Children sent handwritten letters. An 8-year-old girl from Florida drew a picture of Storm standing among red and gold trees beneath a sky full of sun. The drawing was pinned to the wall of the recovery room, right next to Storm's bed. High school students wrote to request seminars on forest rangers and environmental protection, inspired by Storm and the Silverpine case. A state senator called for a full review of all forest land contracts signed in the last 3 years. As for Lucas, he stayed at the station. He declined a commendation, turned down offers to speak on live television. "I'm not a hero," he said. "I'm just a man who was taught by a dog how to trust his instincts again." One morning, with most of the snow melted, Lucas took Storm for a walk around the station grounds. No cameras, no reporters, just the breeze, the smell of damp earth, and the rhythm of Storm's paws on the old trail. They stopped at the base of the largest pine near the forest edge, the place where Lucas had nearly died, where Storm had pressed his nose into blood and led the team back. Storm sat, stared into the woods, no movement, no command. He didn't need to lead anymore. Lucas sat down beside him, said nothing. After a while, he reached out, gently touched the scar on Storm's neck. "You're a symbol now, you know," he said, with a small, dry laugh. "They're talking about building a statue of you at the park entrance." Storm didn't react. He just closed his eyes, as if all glory was weightless. The only thing that mattered was the forest in front of him, still breathing, still needing a guardian. The next day, during a private ceremony at the forestry department, the regional director stepped forward and presented Storm with an honorary badge. Not to wear, but to keep. As a reminder, it was engraved, "For not stepping back, for not staying silent, for living and protecting." Lucas didn't speak. He simply bowed his head and placed a hand atop Storm's head. And then, in a quiet gesture no one taught him, Storm nodded. Outside, the forest stirred again. Wind brushed through the treetops. Birds called softly, and the steady rhythm of life whispered its return. A story had ended. But a symbol had just been carved, not into stone, not into books, but into the memory of those who understood. That once a dog refused to step back and held the line for a forest that could not speak. The meeting took place in a quiet conference room inside the State Forestry Coordination Center. On the table lay a thick folder, its title stamped in bold, "Proposal, Establishment of K9 Task Force, Echo Unit." Lucas sat at the head of the table. The suit he wore might have been the same one from his Ranger Academy graduation. It didn't quite fit anymore. But that didn't matter. Across from him were high-ranking officials from the Department of Natural Resources, senior patrol supervisors, and a few unfamiliar faces. But their eyes told him everything. They'd read the reports, seen the footage, understood what a dog had done when it led a rescue operation. And now they wanted to turn it into a system. "We'd like you to consider a leadership role," one of them said, "overseeing statewide K9 development, your own office, dedicated budget. You wouldn't need to be in the field anymore." Lucas didn't answer right away. He glanced out the window, where, far on the lawn, Storm sat beside a new trainer. The dog was motionless, watching a group of younger dogs run training drills. His gaze was sharp, but quiet, as if waiting to see where Lucas would go next. Lucas turned back, tapping his finger lightly on the table. "I won't sit behind a desk," he said calmly. A brief silence followed. "I don't want to manage, I want to lead." Eyes shifted across the room. "We understand," someone began, "but without you at Central Command, coordinating across the state becomes—" "I don't want the whole state," Lucas interrupted. He pulled a thinner folder from his pocket, clearly marked and tabbed. He laid it on the table. "I just need one sector, Silver Pine and the 3 adjacent zones. I've drafted a proposal, K9 Unit Echo, small scale, mobile, independent, field-focused, direct response to illegal logging, poaching, underground activity. I lead it, and Storm comes back." "You want that dog back in the field?" One man raised an eyebrow. Lucas looked straight at him. He never left. The room went quiet again. Someone looked back through the report. Another leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "He passed his physical." 90% recovered. Technically, he qualifies. "In practice," Lucas added, "no one qualifies more." When the meeting ended, Lucas stepped into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind him, but he already knew. The proposal would go through. Not because of media pressure, not because he was persuasive, but because Storm had done what no system ever could. He made people believe in instinct. 1 month later, at the quiet launch of K9 Unit Echo, there was no press, no stage, no medals. Just Lucas, in field gear, standing to the side with a hand on Storm's back as their unit name echoed from the loudspeaker. A small badge was placed into Lucas's hand. It read, "Unit Echo, not to chase tracks, but to lead the way." Storm sat beside him, silent as always. But this time his eyes weren't fixed on the forest. They looked straight at Lucas, as if to say, "I'm ready, and I chose right." Lucas knelt beside him and whispered, "Let's go. Someone out there needs us again." Storm stood. No bark, no command. Just motion. Forward. From then on, people started whispering about Echo Unit, a quiet task force, no headlines, no show. They appeared when rangers sent distress calls, and vanished once the job was done. Whenever there were signs of ecological violation, the first voice over the radio was always Lucas, and the first print in the mud was Storm's. People began to say, "It doesn't matter who you call. If Storm shows up, there's still hope for the forest." And Lucas, once a man saved by a dog beneath a frozen pine, had become the leader of something new. Not for revenge, not for glory, but to keep a promise, to a forest that still needed guardians, and to a dog who had crossed the line between life and death, and kept walking beside him ever since. That afternoon, the sky cleared, unexpectedly so. After weeks of snow and biting winds that had kept even the bravest indoors, Silverpine finally opened itself to the sky. A soft blue stretched, unbroken, all the way to the horizon. The sun leaned westward, casting golden light down the northern ridge, where wild grass lay pressed flat and patches of snow shimmered like silver scales on the back of a slumbering beast. Storm stood on that ridge. No one led him there. No commands had been given. No one followed. Lucas spotted him from afar, through binoculars in the newly rebuilt observation post. He stood beside Rachel, who had just wrapped up Echo Unit's first field meeting with the adjacent ranger station. Neither of them spoke. They just stared at that lone figure etched against the pale gray sky. Storm did not move. 4 paws planted deep in the snow, his body like a stone pillar. Head lifted, ears poised like a drawn bowstring. He wasn't tracking, wasn't sniffing blood, wasn't chasing anything. He was watching, gazing into the forest, that ancient woodland cloaked in shadow, pulsing like an old heart still beating somewhere deep below the frost. Wind swept up from the valley, tugging at the snow caught in Storm's thick coat, making him look like something out of myth, timeless, ageless, born only to guard. Lucas exhaled, eyes fixed to the lens. "He knows," he murmured. Rachel nodded. She didn't ask. "Knows what?" She didn't need to. Storm knew the forest wasn't safe yet, knew that beyond all that had been uncovered, the arrests, the sealed roads, the exposed plans, some hands remained hidden. Some intentions still lingered. It wasn't suspicion. It was instinct. Storm was never meant to be a symbol, but a dog who had fought, fallen, risen, and now stood between the wild and the world was no longer just an animal. He was vigilance, unyielding, unresting. Lucas lowered the binoculars. He knew Storm wouldn't leave that ridge until the sun disappeared. He was always the last to stand down. Not because he had to, because he chose to. Lucas remembered the first time they met, the day Storm led the winter training unit into the forest and found him tied up, dying, frozen under snow and pine. Storm hadn't barked, hadn't called for help. He had just sat there, watching, as if waiting for Lucas to decide whether he wanted to live. And now, Storm sat the same way, but this time, for the forest. Rachel turned to him, her voice low. "Storm's not just guarding the forest, Lucas. He's reminding us how fragile beauty really is." Lucas said nothing. He only nodded. The sun dropped toward the horizon. The snow on the ridge faded into pale orange. Storm's shadow stretched long, across frozen grass and brittle roots, a dog's shadow, straight, unbroken, unshaken. And only when the last light vanished behind the trees did Storm finally turn. No rush, no hesitation. He walked down the ridge, leaving deep prints in the snow, prints the wind would soon erase. But in the forest's memory, they would remain. The story of a warrior, one without armor, without weapons, without words. Only the will to stand in the right place, at the right time, and never turn his back on what he chose to protect. 1 month after Storm returned to duty, the forest of Silverpine had begun to change. Old markers were rebuilt, observation stations upgraded, and the trails, once used by timber smugglers, were now marked with the footprints of rangers, interns, and sometimes the locals themselves. People had started to come back to the woods, believing, for the first time in years, that it was truly being protected. There were no more gunshots, no more gasoline fires burning through the night, just wind brushing through leaves, branches murmuring, and the steady footsteps of a dog doing a job no one had ever taught him, keeping peace by simply being there. Storm didn't care for medals, didn't notice the cameras. When documentary crews came to film, he would just sit quietly, eyes fixed on the forest's edge. Once, a journalist asked Lucas, "Do you think Storm knows he's a symbol?" Lucas had just smiled. But he knows what's at stake, and he stayed. On an early spring night, as the ice melted and the forest breathed again, soft rain falling like a memory, Lucas sat on the ranger station's porch, holding a cup of cold coffee. Storm lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, ears still alert though his eyes were closed. The breeze carried the scent of new grass. Moonlight filtered through bare branches, catching on the last patches of snow clinging to the rooftop. Lucas leaned down and whispered, not sure if he was speaking to Storm, to himself, or to the forest. "No need for titles?" Storm opened his eyes, but didn't move. "No need for applause." The dog stayed still, but his breathing, calm, deep, seemed to say he was listening. Lucas looked out into the darkness ahead, a forest stretching to the base of the mountains, where someone once tried to take it all away, where he'd once nearly lost his life. But tonight, there was no fear, because beside him stood a guardian who asked for no orders, no rest, no recognition. Only a vow. And Lucas knew, if Storm could speak, the words would be simple, not poetic, not dramatic. Just, "This forest will not bleed, as long as I'm here." He looked up at the sky. The woods ahead were silent, but it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of something once broken and now slowly healing. Bit by bit, under the watch of a creature who made no promises to the world, except that he would never back down. No need for a reason, no need for reward. Just this: wherever there is threat of harm, Storm will be standing in front of it. And the next morning, the first tracks on the Eastern Trail were the same as always. One man, one dog, walking ahead, just like every other day. Not for glory, not for memory, but for a vow they never had to speak aloud. Somewhere deep in the forest, where no one may see, but where the only thing that ever truly mattered still survives. Faith. The story of Lucas, Reynard, and Storm is not a heroic anthem written in the sound of gunfire or decorated by grand victories. It began with something far more fragile: a man abandoned in the forest, and a dog who walked up, didn't bark, didn't panic, just sat there, as if it were the only creature left that still believed that life was worth saving. From that moment, everything changed. Storm didn't just pull Lucas back from the brink of death. He reawakened something inside him, the instinct of a ranger, not just to survive, but to fight. Not for himself, but for the things that needed protecting: justice, truth, and the silent trees that had stood for centuries without ever asking to be thanked. They didn't win because they were stronger. They won because they never backed down, never compromised, never gave up. A dog saved a man, and together, they saved an entire forest.